November 11th, 1983, a Soviet airbase in East Germany. Dawn breaks through a low winter fog. Ground crews are running, not a drill. A command has arrived from Moscow, ordering Su-17 fighter bombers to be armed with nuclear weapons, and stood ready. The guards at the gate are silent. The air is thick with 10 years of mutual terror. The aircraft are loaded with what could be the last payloads they ever carry. In the bunker, a colonel watches the red foam. No one has said the word launch, but every man there knows this is what it looks like before the world ends. The alert status has jumped to a level not seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the trigger? A NATO exercise codenamed Able Archer 83. A simulation, a rehearsal, a mistake. But the men on this base don't know that. They only know the codes, the rockets, the order to wait for the next signal. And so the wait begins. Months earlier, a Soviet spy in London had delivered a warning. He said the Kremlin genuinely believed that NATO was planning a surprise nuclear attack. His information was passed to British intelligence and then filed away as typical Soviet paranoia. That warning disappeared before it ever reached the officials monitoring NATO exercises. One of them was a young codebreaker at RAF Croughton, a bustling listening post in the English Midlands. On November 7th, he noticed something odd. The communications frequency from the highest level of NATO command had suddenly changed. New encryption, new call signs, unusual timing. It looked like what a deployment would look like, not a drill. He asked his superior about it. The answer, don't worry, it's just a game. But he had never seen a game this realistic. Neither at that moment did the men in Moscow who were watching every signal from the west and interpreting them as the first steps of an intended strike. The warning signs multiplied. On the second day of the exercise, NATO used a new code system to authenticate a launch order. The call sign was Mount Launch. 3 hours later, Soviet frontline units in Eastern Europe went on elevated alert. The CIA and the Pentagon saw these alerts on their screens. They were interpreted as procedural exercises. No one flagged them for political leaders. A U.S. Army officer later said, "I had a feeling of dread. It didn't make sense as a Soviet response to a drill, but no one asked me." The Soviets, of course, saw NATO's own exercise for what they feared, a cover for a real attack. The KGB station in London sent a top priority cable to Moscow. The correlation of NATO forces indicates a possibility of immediate military action. The cable was handed to a man named Yuri Andropov, and in that moment, the world's most dangerous misunderstanding began to take on its final shape. Yuri Andropov looked at the cable for a long moment. The General Secretary of the Soviet Union, a man in perpetual pain from kidney failure, had to decide. According to later testimony, then KGB chief Vladimir Khrushchev personally assured him that the Americans were about to strike. The assessment was blunt. The deployment of nuclear forces has reached a level that suggests the USA is preparing to carry out a first strike. Andropov reportedly told his aides, "The imperialists are planning a nuclear war. We cannot allow them to take us by surprise." He gave the order. Soviet nuclear forces were to be prepared for a possible preemptive launch. Tens of thousands of men in missile silos, bomber bases, and submarine commands went to a higher stage of alert. It was not a declaration of war. It was a preparation for it. The decision was made in secrecy. No American knew. In Washington, the exercise was still on track for its climax. The decision that night made catastrophe possible. What exactly happened inside the exercise? NATO simulated a transition from conventional to nuclear war. They practiced the procedures that would be used in a real exchange: encrypted messages, authentication of release codes, and preparation of aircraft for takeoff. The radio traffic was indistinguishable from a real launch order. At that moment, in the Soviet General Staff in Moscow, a map of Europe was marked with symbols indicating NATO nuclear strikes. The Soviets sent a message to all KGB stations: Urgent Alert 1. No nuclear weapon was actually being used. The missiles were not being launched, but the electrical signals that represented them were exactly what Soviet monitoring systems had been designed to detect. The exercise was a simulation, but Soviet preparations were real. At a U.S. base in West Germany, a young airman saw Soviet MiGs launch from a nearby base at high speed. He thought they were coming for him. If this story is new to you, subscribe. There are dozens more the world tried to forget. The immediate response was quiet, methodical, and terrifying. Soviet SS-20 launchers in Eastern Europe were moved to new positions. Bomber squadrons were put on strip alert. Submarines slid from their bases into deep water where they could launch undetected. The KGB began a disinformation campaign, feeding anti-NATO stories to Western media, suggesting that the United States wanted to fight a limited nuclear war in Europe. The purpose was to weaken public opinion before a possible attack. Meanwhile, in the West, the exercise went on, its participants unaware that they were triggering the Soviet war machine. There was no overt panic. That was not how it worked. But on the Soviet side, some officers later recalled that the orders were the most urgent they had ever received. In the Baltic, a Soviet patrol boat fired a deterrent warning at a NATO ship that got too close. It was a spark in the hay, and the hay was ready to ignite. The international alarm came when the sudden Soviet alert status was detected by NATO's own intelligence. For the first time since 1962, Soviet air forces in East Germany launched sorties in full electronic combat profile. The aircraft were armed with nuclear-tipped missiles. Reports reached the White House Situation Room. A Pentagon analyst, Robert M. Gates, later admitted, "I believe there was a chance of a catastrophic misreading." The message from Moscow was clear. The Soviet Union was preparing for the final war. How close did we come? According to one U.S. Air Force intelligence officer, the Soviets notified their pilots of a warning of a possible first strike. The pilots had been given permission to fire if attacked, but no one fired. The order to launch had not been given. A stroke of chance, or the restraint of men on both sides, held the line. The world would never know just how close it came until years later. The human cost was not tallied in body counts because no bodies had fallen. But the cost was real. Men and women on both sides who believed they were living their final hours. An American intercept operator in West Germany later told historian John Glassor that he heard Soviet voice traffic fall into a low, frightened monotone. One Soviet pilot radioed, "We are being attacked. Launch order received." The operator said he felt his blood turn to ice. On the Soviet side, a colonel in a silo outside Vinnytsia was minutes from turning his key for a launch that would doom millions. He later said he thought of his children and missed his dead wife. He was crying. None of these people are named in the official reports. Their trauma was buried in psych evaluations. The exercise ended on November 13th, but the nightmares continued. Some of these veterans never recovered. The psychological burns were every bit as real as radiation. For years, the near miss was hidden. The Exercise After Action report called it a successful rehearsal. The Reagan administration denied there was any real danger. The CIA did not brief Congress until 1987. Only after the Berlin Wall fell, when Soviet archives began to open, did the depth of the misunderstanding emerge. In 1990, Robert Gates admitted in his memoir that he and others had dismissed Soviet fears as paranoia. The reckoning was swift for some. Several intelligence officers were assigned to review what went wrong. But no one lost their job. No commander, politician, or general was held accountable. The men on the front line who had waited for the signal were silent, because they were not part of the official story. The cover-up, as much as the misreading, became the second tragedy. The lesson was clear. Even a false alarm can bring the world to the edge, if it is loud enough. Able Archer 83 left an invisible scar on history. It convinced the Soviet Union to develop plans for nuclear-armed anti-satellite weapons to blind American eyes. It also pushed Ronald Reagan, who had once joked about bombing the Soviets, to eventually meet Gorbachev and sign the INF Treaty. The legacy is not a monument, but a permanent edge. It changed the way intelligence services interpret exercises and led to the creation of an agreed set of signals in the 1991 Bush-Gorbachev agreement. But the deeper lesson is that ordinary humans on both sides were the final failsafe. The Soviet colonel who wiped his eyes and kept his key unmoved. The American operator who held his breath when the chatter turned to silence. This was the real nuclear disaster. The one that did not happen because men trusted their own humanity more than the orders. Subscribe to Nuclear Disasters.